Faster My, hello and welcome to this edition of Agenda. I'm Ewan Gorn. 3 new heritage sites look set to join the island's registered buildings list, but is government doing enough to keep it updated? Campaigners say no, but DEFA says it's improving. And the Manx Labour Party leader explains why she's hoping more progressive politicians are elected in both the general and local authority elections this year. A campaigner says government is falling well behind when it comes to protecting buildings of heritage interest across the island. It says the Cosy Nook in Port Erin, Trafalgar House in Douglas and the Mitre in Kirkmichael were put forward for registration. If approved, they'd join around 250 buildings on the list, protecting them against demolition or significant changes without prior consent. Charles Gard stepped in with others to protect Trafalgar House when it was under threat of being knocked down. He spoke to me.
It is a peculiar shape. It's a little wedge at the bottom of Head Road. We've traced it back to at least 1830. And I think if the government are going to put up a sign saying historic harbour, then you don't want to be knocking down the most historic building that there is. That really is its prime importance. It was a very successful pub. There's so many bands used to play in there. It was a thriving place. Why that's faded, I don't know. That's not really the point. The fact is, I think if we are to preserve the environs, then the fact that was just going to be demolished to be replaced by some flats, I think, without any consideration, that's what worried me. If it had have been registered, and it should have been registered decades ago, then at least there would have been a sensible consideration and discussion. As it was, the digger was within a few feet of it, and a friend of mine, David Vertheim, and myself put in over the weekend an emergency plea to have the demolition stopped. And they did put this holding order on it, and they're now considering whether they should register it or not. I cannot say they definitely were going to demolish it, the people there, but it shouldn't even be considered at this moment. It shouldn't have been a fear.
Well, there's a proposal now to register it. It's on the market. You've got to maybe put 2 and 2 together there and assume that because it's been preserved and will be put on the register, that's why it's now for sale. Some might argue that by registering buildings, we are getting in the way of development, getting in the way of what would have been perhaps new flats for young people, a rooftop wine bar, I'm led to believe as well. What do you say in response to that? How do you strike that balance between protecting your areas of interest and moving with the times and giving people what they want, which is new homes?
It's most definitely a balance, yes. And it is on the sale. It is for sale for $475,000, which seems a very steep price to me. I can't believe that an architect could not have incorporated that building into what's going up next to it and made it a small wine bar, made it a feature. Say, look, we're proud of this. It's a lovely little, early 19th century building. Why couldn't they have done something with it? I think the knee-jerk reaction is, just demolish it. It's old. It's rubbish. We don't want it. And if we do that all across the Isle of Man, what are we left with? Well, you can see. You can see what we're going to be left with when you see what goes up there. I objected to it, partly on the strain it's going to put on my eyes looking at it. And I say this is a personal opinion, of course. It's horrendous, and it's totally out of keeping with the harbour. And I can't understand why the planning committee have said this is fine. It's not.
But when we look across South Quay, I mean, it's a mix match the whole way along.
It is a mess, but North Quay has really been very cleverly preserved, and it's wonderful. You can sit out there in the summer. You've got the marina. It is a very successful piece of careful preservation and development. And it hasn't stopped people opening restaurants and wine bars and offices and shops. It hasn't stopped that. We can manage that. It's not the end of the world. But we're going to have to sit on that side and look at this thing. And at least the Trafalgar will mitigate that a bit.
Well, you had to step in, at the last hour, the final hour here. What does that say about the processes we have in place for registration?
Gosh, where would I start on that, Ewan? What does it say? It says that, yet again, Obviously people are sick to death of me saying this. There are dozens and dozens of buildings that should have been registered 40 years ago. The fact that we're even discussing this now is pathetic, frankly. I mean, where have the government been on this? They've only got to do this once. They've only got to register these buildings once. It would take the salary of an expert for 2 or 3 years. It's a small amount. Once it's done, it's done. And then any building that is under threat for development or demolition has to go through the proper process of evaluating it and saying, no, we need to keep it. At the moment, you can just come along with a digger and take it down. That's not acceptable.
So do you think it's a staffing issue? It's a lack of staff?
Well, it is a lack of staff, yes. No, actually, I'll tell you what it is. It's a lack of will. It's a lack of ethos. And I'm afraid it comes from the top. The fact that people... I've heard some MHK saying, we don't want to keep all these heritagey things because they give the Isle of Man a 1950s look and we want to be modern and drive ahead. Well, you can do both. I mean, to be getting rid of our heritage, that just means everything, including our language, our way of life, our laxy wheel, everything. You can't do that.
Do you think that argument, that zero-sum game, which is if you've got one thing, you can't have the other thing, do you reckon that's a complete misnomer?
Well, why haven't they taken the pyramids down? Because they're in the way. I mean, for heaven's sake, this is a huge asset to the Isle of Man, our railways and our heritage. I mean, tourism has shrunk, of course, but those who come, and never mind them, what about us? This is my heritage. It was my ancestors who built all this, and I want to carry on enjoying it because it's fabulous.
OK, well, final question. You're in DEFA or whatever, you're in the planning building, you've been given carte blanche to do whatever you want to make the situation better. Where do you start?
You just advertise for a couple of experts who can spend the next 3 years getting these buildings registered once and for all, and then it's done.
Heritage campaigner Charles Gard. The Environment Minister insists good progress is being made on updating the registered buildings list. More than 200 sites are waiting to be assessed, though, some of which were flagged up in the 1990s. With a new registered buildings officer now in post, Geoffrey Boot says things are looking up. I spoke to him.
Frequently we are reactive rather than proactive, and when buildings come to our notice where there are issues that might result in demolition or major alteration, then we are of the belief that the building, or we are told that the building is of historic and architectural interest, we'll move to protect that building and at least serve a notice that holds things until we've carried out research and consultation to see whether the building is indeed worthy of preservation.
Well, you mentioned it in your comments there about being reactive rather than proactive. Does it say a lot about the process that you had to get involved at the last minute in some of these applications and some of these buildings?
Well, we don't always get involved at the last moment. We have a list of buildings that we are looking at. We don't make that public for obvious reasons, but it's the nature of the game, as it were, that if one of those buildings seems to be at risk, then it would be sensible to serve a notice of proposed registration so that we can at least do the work and make sure that the building doesn't suffer any damage or demolition.
But should it get to that stage? I mean, some might say it's unfair on developers for this to be happening, when work in some cases has started or there's investment already gone into big plans and redesign. So do you think that's fair on developers to get involved this far in?
Well, I think there's an element of if you've got a building that is old and has significant architectural interest, you will be aware of that as a developer or even a private individual. And we have an open door policy in the planning department. We now have 2 buildings registrations officers, and a cursory conversation with them would reveal whether or not there may be some architectural historic interest that might result in registration. So there's an element that works both ways, really. The developers might try and move under the radar, as it were, and demolish buildings which have some interest without going through the process. At the same time, you are correct. It does seem that sometimes we come in late in the process, but I'm sure any developer or individual that's gone through a proper planning process will be aware whether or not the building has got some interest.
So is this a legacy of the fact that, quite simply, we haven't processed lots of applications for registration? We haven't done the legwork here?
Well, we've made some progress during this administration, and we're making more rapid progress now. And we are fully staffed at long last. It's not been a financial issue in resource terms. It's been more a human resource in obtaining staff with the right qualifications. And we have been a bit stop-start, but we have a gentleman in post now who is driving that process forward. He comes from a good background and knows his brief well. So we are progressing and hope to make more progress as the time goes on.
Can I ask how many sites are pending inclusion on the registered buildings list?
We've got something like 272 buildings on the register at the moment, and we have around 200 plus that are possible candidates. We did carry out a desktop exercise a short while ago to have a look at the pending list, as it were. Some buildings are gone, some were patently not of interest and were removed, but 200 plus is where we're at the moment.
And how long have some of those been pending? I mean, is this stretching back a long time, or these recent?
There are a few recent additions, buildings that have been brought to our attention, but most of them are fairly long-lived and have been there before my time in the department. And during this administration, I have been trying to push things forwards, but as I said earlier, we have had human resource issues in terms of availability of suitably qualified officers.
So when do we get to the point where that pending inclusion list is cut right down, Mr. Boot?
I would like to say sooner rather than later, but it's a long list. There is a lot of work to do on the buildings. Sadly, I think we will be in a fairly reactive position for some period of time. A lot of the buildings are not at risk. They're just brought to our notice. Some of them are government-owned and heritage buildings. Some of them are more at risk, as we found with the recent notices that have been served, and where there are imminent threats from either demolition or conversion. So we take the buildings as we need to. But I, for one, would like to see faster progress, but there's only so much officers can do, and we are where we are, really.
Well, I have to put these comments to you to give you the chance to respond, but Charles Gard, Heritage campaigner involved in the Trafalgar House sort of campaign, he's saying DEFA really need to show leadership on this and maybe employ even more registered building officers and just get this done over a shorter period. And then in the long term, we will have an up-to-date registered building list. So what do you say to that?
Well, I think resource is an issue, and it has been during this administration. It's one that I've grappled with. Not necessarily, as I said earlier, a financial issue, more of an availability of suitably qualified staff who are willing to come onto the island. We have tried during this administration to engage with the heritage organisations, and I did at one stage have a plan that perhaps we could contract out some of this work to some the individuals who are knowledgeable on the island to do some preliminary work for us. But that offer wasn't taken up, so we had to work with our own in-house resource. Let's quantify this. There are not that many buildings at risk. It would be nice to have everything registered, and there will probably still be more to do in the future. But when buildings are at risk, and we know they are, and they're brought to our attention, we take appropriate action.
Environment, Food and Agriculture Minister Geoffrey Boot. You're listening to Agenda on Manx Radio. The Manx Labour Party wants to make sure no one is left out of a job as part of the island's move to a low-carbon economy. Government is committed to net zero emissions by 2050, but some are concerned jobs in some trades could be lost as a result. Labour leader Joni Farragher says investment in education and training is needed to avoid this, as she explained to me.
There's a big theme in Professor Curran's impact report, which he completed for the Isle of Man, and in our programme going forward for tackling climate change. The idea of just transition is that the cost is not borne by the people who are at the lower end of the socio-economic spectrum or the majority of people. The cost is shouldered by people who can actually afford to shoulder that cost, so that certain elements of society aren't going to actually be disadvantaged by our transition over to a carbon-free society. We're bringing everybody with us. So that's the idea of a just transition. And the reason that we're talking about education is that we need to, in order to make sure that we do have a just transition, we need to upskill existing sectors that are quite dependent upon our current structure of carbon fuel society. So we need to upskill those people into the trades that we need so that they are being brought along and they're not going to be left out and found out of a job and out of pocket. So that's a big undertaking, but it makes perfect sense to use those people in the new trades that we need.
So how do you bring those people along? I mean, you're sort of saying that what they've been doing is going to become redundant. I mean, it must be quite demoralising. So how do you bring them along in that just transition? That
is the way, really, is by sort of government initiatives that would really be a centralised initiative to upskill people, to train them in a different trade. It would be similar. It's still potentially, say, around generating energy, but it's just got a different focus. And they would be paid to train, so they would just have a normal wage whilst they were training on that, and then they would have a kind of guaranteed job at the end of it. The idea of it is that it appeals to those people because they're not losing pocket. There's
still things to be done in terms of climate change and government's action plan, and you're part of that, the Citizens Forum there. What's the reaction from Manx Labour to the sort of climate elements of the latest budget?
Yeah, so 17 million for climate change, which is it's partially welcomed, I suppose, but it's not enough. Basically, it's not enough. So that money does need to be used wisely. That does need to have targeted outcomes. So I would say that ideally that money would be focused towards home energy efficiency, so either grants or zero interest loans. It's not really enough, I suppose, to say that we are putting money into this. We do need the money, but we also really do need the ideology behind it. Yeah, I guess I'm not really convinced this administration has that.
Well, there is now a climate. The bill is getting close to being passed, which sets the sort of legislative framework that requires the public bodies to follow those commitments and achieve them. I mean, does that not give you hope that the ideology is coming? It's being backed up in the legislation.
I'm very disappointed with the bill, I have to say. I think it's essentially a bill which is passing the baton on to the next administration. I was disappointed with the debate in Keys, and all I can say is that I sincerely hope that when it goes to Tynwald, that the members of the Legislative Council are able to adapt it slightly.
Well, do you think action has slowed because there's an election looming, because nobody wants to commit to anything before a new House of Keys comes in?
Possibly. That does seem to be the case, but it's disappointing if that is the case, because we just can't have this short-termism whereby as soon as it comes into actual election year, you're missing a whole year of action each time, each electoral cycle. It really shouldn't be like that. So I'm really not convinced that they're doing the best thing by the electorate there, especially when you take into account the overwhelming response to the public consultation on climate change and what people were really on board with robust action, and this bill is not robust action.
We'll move to the election. Well, we've got to, because obviously you're a political party and you want to be at that table making those decisions. The local authority elections first. Quick question, do local authority elections matter? And if they do, then why?
Yes, local authority elections do matter. They're part of our democracy. There's lots of reasons why they matter, really, I suppose. local authority deals with issues that matter to the electorate that are on more of a national level that the MHKs deal with. We personally feel like they're important to us because we've tried to use them as a great way to actually establish trust and rapport with the electorate. By getting those local councillors in there, they can meet the people, they can show that they are able to deliver on their promises, and so that we've sort of tried to build up trust and rapport there using them as well.
And do you think having a good representation at local authority level will strengthen your party?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can, if you're an MHK for somewhere where you have party members in your local council as well, then you're going to work as a much more effective and coherent team. You're going to be singing from the same hymn sheet. So that makes a much more effective government, really, for the electorate.
And would Manx Labour Party ever hope to actually control an authority, or is that something that's just not achievable, and it is going to be more about how you can influence independence and how you can guide policies and debates?
Well, I'm not really sure. I mean, I wouldn't really want to rule it out that we wouldn't have all of the seats in an authority, because it's certainly a possibility. Obviously, from the last by-election in Derby Ward, the Manx Labour Party took both of the available seats. So it is something that could happen, although it's not an aim of ours to do that necessarily.
What can be achieved in terms of the influence that you want to exert in local authorities? Is it about guiding discussions rather than, as we just talked about, actually having full control or a voting majority?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the feedback that I've received from our councillors, a lot of it is about kind of essentially influence on the council, and that they are trying to sort of, I guess, make their point sort of agreed with. The closer ideological coherence you have, obviously, the more effective a team will be. So if we're able to have more progressives in general on local authority, that will make us very happy.
And that then, throwing forward to the big election afterwards, does that sort of mantra extend then to the House of Keys, where it is obviously harder to get people in?
Yes. I genuinely do think, looking at the political landscape right now, that September will bring us quite a few progressives.
So why do you think that?
Well, just having looked at who has already declared and the people who are sort of making noises about declaring, it seems to me to be people outside of a traditional political mould. And there's a reason for that. I think that there is a sense of frustration. There is a sense, actually, that our government is a bit out of touch with the needs and wants of the electorate. There are some sort of, I guess, what you'd call hot button issues that they haven't delivered on, despite overwhelming public support for them, that I think has really kind of got people quite politically motivated.
And these are housing and the climate, they're the ones you mean, yeah? Yeah,
I'm also talking about cannabis legislation because, of course, we've had that consultation, the public consultation, which showed huge support for introducing legislation to allow medicinal cannabis. Obviously, our administration's response was not on my watch. And that, I think, I've heard a lot of people discussing that and how it kind of did fly in the face of what the public were quite clearly saying that they wanted.
Well, are you at risk there, though, of being, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but being an echo chamber to an extent? I mean, progressives care about things like, cannabis reform, drug reform, education, climate, etc. But the Isle of Man voters tend to return a fairly conservative House of Keys for the most part. I mean, are you aware that you might not be in sync with that silent majority?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say at all that we are going to have 24 progressive MHKs in September. I don't think that would be the case. I'm just thinking that there might be a more progressive mix in there. And I'm obviously hoping that that's the case, because that is the ideology that I think is the best for everybody. And I feel like there's a potential that is starting to be embedded within our society as well, that we are actually starting to open our eyes maybe to more people-orientated policies and what the outcomes of those are in terms of well-being and how it lifts our lives to have those progressive policies in place.
the leader of the Manx Labour Party, Joni Farragher. That's all from this programme. We'll be back with more from Agenda soon, and you can listen again to this edition via Spotify or through the Manx Radio website. But for now, Guramayu and goodbye.